Good morning. My name is Luciana Gama Muniz. I am a project director at the Brazilian Center for International Relations, CEBRI. Our event today is a partnership with Konrad Adenauer Foundation, and I am very, very pleased to welcome all of you here today to discuss the reorientation of multilateral politics from a European perspective. Before we start the debate, I would like to hand it over to Kevin Oswald. He will give us his welcome remarks on behalf of CAS. Kevin, please.
Thank you very much, Luciana, and good morning to everyone from my side as well. As Deputy Representative of the Konrad Adenauer Foundation in Brazil, I would like to welcome you all on behalf of CAS and also on behalf of our country program director, Anja Cimek, to today's online event. It is a great pleasure to be here today with our dear colleagues from CEBRI and some very distinct experts on issues such as global governance, international affairs, and EU foreign policy. This event takes place against the background of this year's main topic of our CAS-CEBRI cooperation to research and monitor the reorientation of multilateral politics. Today, we will have a discussion specifically on the European perspective on multilateralism, and I'm very much looking forward to the debate. However, before we get started, let me just briefly share the information with you that the registration for this year's Forte de Copacabana International Security Conference is open. Forte de Copacabana is a security conference organized by CAS and CEBRI with support of the delegation of the European Union in Brazil. And this year's topic will be New Frontiers and Sovereignty on the Brink of Global Challenges. The conference will take place in an entirely virtual format, and I would like to take the opportunity to gladly invite you all, because we will be discussing similar topics like the ones today that might be interesting to you. And so take the advantage and take a look at CAS website or CEBRI website and register for Forte de Copacabana on the 24th and 25th of September. Thank you very much. And now, last but not least, I wish you all a very fruitful and interesting debate. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. Now I would like to pass the floor to Ambassador Gelson Fonseca from CEBRI's Board of Trustees. He will introduce us to today's discussions. And meanwhile, Kevin and I will be following the event on the backstage. So we wish you all a very good discussion. Thank you. Ambassador Gelson, please, the floor is yours. Your microphone, Ambassador, you need to turn it on, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Luciana, for introducing this webinar. In the name of the President of CEBRI, Dr. Pio Borges, I would like to salute our speakers today. Professor Maria Regina, she's going to conduct our work today. Professor Dawisson, who is an expert on these multilateral issues, and he is from the University of Minas Gerais, and Professor Freudenstein, who has long expertise on the European Union and multilateral affairs also. I don't know, we are waiting for Zaki Laïdi, but I don't know whether he's going to participate. We had some problems in his connection with internet. I don't know if he will be able or not to attend this meeting. Anyway, it's a privilege for CEBRI to have such accomplished thinkers in international relations with us today. As Dr. Kevin mentioned, CEBRI and the Konrad Adenauer have a long partnership, and this project is a project that is another initiative within this partnership. This project on multilateralism, reorientation of multilateralism, is led by Professor Ana Jaguaribe. And she asked me to say a very brief word on the scope of the project. The starting point is the crisis of global governance. The Americans like to call it the demise of the liberal order. One aspect of this crisis is another crisis within the crisis of multilateralism. The signs of the problems are very visible. The paralysis of the Security Council, the lack of progress in trade and climate change negotiations, and most dramatic, the lack of a global response to a global crisis, the COVID pandemics. From this starting point, we are going to ask two questions. The first one is, what are the causes of the disarray of the international order? There is a formula that tries to solve the problem: the return of geopolitics, in this scenario, realpolitik will prevail. But this is a form, it's not a response. No? And the fact is that since the end of the Cold War, we have different arrangements of power. We have a unipolar moment, we have perhaps a multipolar moment, and now you have a combination of a bipolar factor with aspects of a multilateral, multipolar situation. So the system is very complex. We are not. One of the focus of the research is on the competition or rivalry between China and US, which we think constitutes the decisive element to understand the crisis of multilateralism. So this is the first part of the question. The second part is, what are the implications of this crisis for the emerging countries? One of the aspects of the crisis of multilateralism is the weakening of the rule of law in the international system. Weakening in two senses. The norms are disrespected and disregarded, and it's becoming very difficult, in certain areas almost impossible, to create norms, to produce norms where they are necessary. And so for developing countries, for emerging countries, the rule of law is essential for a very simple reason. For countries that do not have power, the presence in the international scene depends on international order regulated by norms. And so we are going to try to understand in 4 specific areas: trade, sustainable development, the digital economy, and peaceful solution of conflicts, how this weakening of the rule of law is affecting the emerging countries. We to try to there is a third question would be how we are going to connect the global and the regional. Now, That would be perhaps the I don't say original perspective, but that will be the specific focus of our research. How the regions are reacting to this situation. We had a webinar with the Asian colleagues. Now I have with the our European guests. And we are thinking about this connection in two senses. First sense, is it possible, is it conceivable that the regional and security agreements or arrangements or institutions in the regional, in the regions could bridge the gap between this deficit of the rule of law in the global system? This is the first part of the question. The second part would be how the Europeans, of course, I imagine there are many views of this problem, but how Europe are viewing the global situation. Europe has a tradition of being a sort of a champion of multilateralism. One of the problems we have today, we do not have among the powers other champions. Is Europe still a champion of multilateralism? Who could be the partners of if you are trying to reorient multilateralism, if you are trying to create a multilateralism for this very complex scenario, for this very complex system of power that you have today. So the word is our, I pass the floor to Regina. She's going to conduct our work from now on. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Good morning and good afternoon to all. We have a problem with our guest, our third guest, Dr. Zaki Laïdi, but I don't know if, I think he's coming on. So, and first I have to introduce our distinguished guest for this webinar on the European vision of the multilateral framework redefinition. I'll start with Dr. Laïdi. He would come in a minute, I guess. He's a senior advisor to the High Representative of the Union for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy of the European Union. He's a science school professor on leave and wrote extensively on global affairs and Europe as a global actor. Dr. Roland Freudenstein has been a member of the Foreign and Security Planning Staff of the European Commission in Brussels, and since 2008, head of the research and deputy director of the Wilfried Martens Center for European Studies, and since October 2015 is policy director. He has contributed to debates and published extensively on European integration, international security, German-Polish relations, global democracy support, and about Russia and Eastern Europe. And finally, Professor Dawisson Belém Lopes. Professor Dawisson is a professor of international relations and comparative politics at the Federal University of Minas Gerais and a researcher of the National Council for Technological and Scientific Development in Brazil. He is the current Deputy Dean for International Affairs of the Federal University of Minas Gerais, having authored 4 books and dozens of articles on topics related to Latin American politics, Brazilian foreign policy, and international institutions. So I think we should start. And after Ambassador Gelson has made some comments on our main subject, and special on the diagnosis of the crisis of multilateralism. For me, it's a crisis of legitimacy, a crisis of representation, and I mean, to accommodate the multipolarity at large, and a crisis of accommodating diversity, which I think maybe is more important because it has to go beyond the Occidental models, let's just say, and to accommodate other cultures, etc. I mean, that's a personal perspective, but I think I would specify a little more the questions, the specific questions, because we have done the same seminars on the Asia as Ambassador Gelson and Brazil, and now we have the European perspective on this multilateral framework definition. And the first question is that, is it possible to think of an European vision of this redefinition or not? I think that's the first question. We take for granted that there is an European vision. So I pose to you the question, does it exist? And very specifically, I have a four set of questions. What could be the principle guiding the political framework for this revision? General principles. The second one is, can the European example with the common market be used for a multilateral framework with global scope? Third question, could Europe still play the role of a normative power at the global scene as in the past, given the return of geopolitics? And finally, how can Europe contribute to diminish the divides which have been created by the US-China conflict? So these are general questions, and I pose to you. And if Dr. Zaki Laïdi is here, I don't see him. So if he's not, okay. Well, I don't see him. I think he still has probably connection problem. So, Dr. Freudenstein, could you start? And then we go to Dawisson. Please, Dr.
Yes, so Maria Regina, thank you so much for having me. It's a great honor to speak. Also a great honor to be with Professors Dawisson, Belém, Lopes, and Gelson, Fonseca. So it's great to be with you. Let me just say this about the Martens Center where I work. The Martens Center is the think tank of the European People's Party, which is the biggest political party family in the European Union, the center right in European politics. And our job basically is to advise them. So, you know, you'll forgive me in my further remarks. You please forgive me for being less theoretical and a little bit more oriented towards practical politics. I would also like to, of course, thank the Konrad Adenauer Foundation for not only co-organizing this, co-hosting this series of events, but also for having me. And I have worked for the Konrad Adenauer Foundation for 9 years, and we are still on speaking terms. So I really appreciate that. And I would like to now switch to the questions that we've been asked, and maybe right away say that there might not be one European perspective, there might actually be several European perspectives, but we will see that later on when Zaki Laïdi, Professor Zaki Laïdi makes his remarks. Now, as to the questions. So we're talking about the EU as a normative power, or maybe even as an example to connect the global to the regional and to strengthen regions themselves. We're talking about a reform and thereby a strengthening, hopefully, of the international system and of multilateralism. And we're talking about US-China relations and what Europe can do, what the European Union can do to diminish tensions. You know, all this reminds me of a famous poster that many German offices, usually in like city halls, in customer relations departments of German bureaucracy, they had this poster that was always the same, had the same caption. It was only slightly self-ironic. It said, you know, impossible things we deliver immediately, but miracles take a little longer. So I think that sets the tone for answering these questions and the questions that we've been asked. So I think I would start with the question of the European Union as an example, as maybe a normative power, and possibly as a blueprint or a pattern for other regional organizations in the world. I'm starting with that because my answer is going to be the shortest one of the three questions. The answer in this case is that, you know, as Mahatma Gandhi said when he was asked about what he thinks about Western democracy, he said, I think it would be a good idea. So I think it would be a good idea if the European Union, with its internal functioning and its system, was used as a pattern by other countries. But I don't have much of a hope or optimism, or actually even believing it probable that this example is actually transferable to other parts of the world. Why am I saying this? Simply because the European Union is the only regional organization in the world that actually practices, not only preaches, but practices the principle of supranationalism, of the supranational exercise of power. In other words, you know, when the founding fathers of European integration were almost literally standing on the smoldering ruins of Europe after World War II, they said, we cannot continue like this with kind of, you know, a concert of great powers and power politics and completely independent states cooperating or not cooperating, whether depending on the actual situation, the current situation. So we cannot continue like that. We have to pool elements of our sovereignty. We have to put elements of our sovereignty together and create institutions that can actually, in some cases, act against individual member states. And that is supranationalism. And I mean, there's a lot more theory that I could inject.
But do you see me?
But I would like to.
Yeah, you see my square, but not my face. Okay, you can imagine then.
All right.
Integrated camera seen as a system. Hello.
Hi.
Okay.
Can I continue?
I'm sorry.
Okay, never mind. Okay,
okay.
I'm continuing now. So this is already the end of my first point. So I think that, you know, the European Union with its supranational model of the exercise of sovereignty is a willing pattern for any taker in the world. But I'm afraid that neither Mercosur nor ASEAN nor the Gulf Cooperation Council are either capable or willing to actually adopt this particular aspect of European integration. But if so, it would be a great thing. Now, on the international, on the global level, of course, I don't see any perspective of a truly supranational exercise, even of elements of state power. I mean, we've never had this, even in the best of days of the United Nations system. We did not truly have a supranational exercise of power. It was always sovereign nation states cooperating or not cooperating. And yes, there is this two-class system of member states of the UN with the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council that have a veto power, that are kind of, you know, in a class of their own in the UN system. but these are still independent, totally sovereign nation states, and there is no supranational power that could rule against them. Okay, so second point, how about the future of multilateralism and what could the European Union do to strengthen it? Now, for simplicity's sake, I will just stick to the World Trade Organization, and also there I'll be very general, and then I'll switch to the United Nations system. You know that the World Trade Organization goes back to the General Agreement of Tariff and Trade, so it's older actually than the well, it comes from about the same era as the United Nations, but it's separate organizationally. And about the World Trade Organization, yes, it is in crisis. It is, I think, the crisis of the WTO is one important aspect of the crisis of multilateralism these days. And indeed, I think we see in the debate about the shortcomings of the current WTO system and possible reform ideas, we see that we see a crisis of globalization, actually. We see that there are more and more countries and more groups within countries, including the so-called rich North, which groups and countries which think that they have been on the losing side of a process of globalization. They've been on the losing side of a relatively free trade global economic world order. And I think as long as we don't address their concerns, I do not see a return to a fully functioning World Trade Organization, and therefore a return to a fully functional, globalized economic system, which is, of course, ultimately and should be to the benefit of all. Having said that, just one tiny thought at the end of this WTO chapter, let's not deceive ourselves. Despite all the shortcomings, the process of globalization that we've had since the 1980s has contributed to lifting hundreds of millions of people. Some people speak of 500 million or even more inhabitants of this planet from poverty into some kind of ability to determine their own future, ability to achieve a certain minimal level of prosperity. So, you know, before we completely vilify the neoliberal globalization of the last 30 years, we better, or 35 years, we better take account of this fact. Without this globalization, the world would be in a much worse shape today than it actually is. Now, as to the UN system, I think we have to separate between the United Nations Security Council, and especially the 5 permanent members, and the rest of the UN system, meaning the General Assembly, but also the agencies of the UN, like the World Health Organization, UN High Commissioner of Human Rights, UNICEF, UNRWA, and all these different agencies, because very simply, the UN Security Council and its 5 permanent members are a little bit of a universe in themselves. They're almost like a separate part of the UN system. And I tell you right away, I can finish this point right here by saying that I don't see a fundamental reform of that part of the United Nations system at the moment, simply because the current permanent members would all have to agree on such a reform. And I cannot see this agreement except for sticking to the status quo. I mean, that is very simple, very simply the smallest common denominator. So let's not waste more energy on that point. However, when it comes to the agencies of the United Nations, I think a lot can be done to reform them, to strengthen them, but this presupposes that countries and, of course, organizations like the European Union are willing to put resources and time and political energy into this process. we have a very negative example over the last couple of years with the United States. We can all agree on that one. For example, if you take the World Health Organization, the United States has said over these, especially over these last couple of months in the Corona crisis, that China is abusing the World Health Organization, and therefore the United States are withdrawing even further. Well, that's the wrong approach. It is true that China has made extraordinary efforts, like some other authoritarian powers, but especially China, extraordinary efforts to utilize the World Health Organization and other parts of the UN system. But that is because there was a vacuum created by some Western countries, especially the United States. So this is my appeal is, if you want to counter the indeed often nefarious influence of China and other authoritarians in the UN system, you have to re-engage and not disengage. Okay, third point, the US-China tensions. Now, completely frankly speaking, I can say Europe's role is not some kind of arbiter. Europe's role is not some kind of neutral, equidistant entity that needs to bring these two sometimes unreasonable powers back to reality and back to cooperation. That is not Europe's job. Why? First of all, because the oldest and deepest external relationship that the European Union has is the transatlantic alliance. This was confirmed this very morning, or early or late last night for you guys in Rio. So this morning in Brussels time, in the State of the Union speech by Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, who said exactly this, the oldest and deepest relationship. Even before she was talking about the UK and Brexit, she named the transatlantic relationship. So second very important point in this, don't concentrate on the White House. Fortunately, and contrary to places like Moscow and Beijing, the United States of America is much, much bigger than the White House. There are the states, there is Congress, there are media, there is civil society, there is public opinion. All these actors make up the United States as a partner, and they remain partners of the European Union, and they remain partners in trying to strengthen multilateralism. So, and maybe the last point here, I think we all hope that Joe Biden wins the election on 3rd of November. And I tell you, this is going to make it even easier for Europe to take on a more responsible role in this transatlantic relationship. Because indeed, sometimes in trade, but very much on security, this relationship has been lopsided. The United States has carried a completely unfair part of the burden of assuring peace, of deterring potential aggressors, and Europe has to take on more responsibility. Now, the irony is that Trump kept talking about this, whereas Joe Biden will be the one who makes it more probable that Europe actually positively engages in building its military capacities in cooperation with the United States, which will be a much easier partner, not only in terms of multilateral institutions, but also a much easier partner in terms of strengthening NATO and rebuilding, in fact, the Atlantic Alliance. So it will be easier for a German chancellor to argue for higher defense expenditure if Joe Biden is president, because then that chancellor doesn't look like Trump's poodle. It's as brutal as that. My Republican friends, of whom I still have some, hate me for saying this, but this is the naked truth. So, so let me emphasize that with the current opinion polls, and really they have been very stable in the United States for a couple of months already. I think we can hope, at least we can hope for a change in the White House, and then many things will be much, much easier. But last word about China itself. Look, the Chinese Communist Party is not our friend. I don't think it's anybody's friend. I think the Chinese Communist Party cannot even be truly a partner for anyone, because relationship on a level playing field, relationship from equal to equal, is not a category in which the Chinese Communist Party thinks. The Chinese Communist Party wants to create a world in which China may not control everything, but certainly nothing in the world happens against the interests of China. And it uses something we call digital authoritarianism, a combination of technological developments and political ruthlessness that the world hasn't seen yet, or is beginning to understand right now. So this is another thing which will be easier with Joe Biden in the White House and Kamala Harris, of course. It will be a transatlantic alliance which together faces the digital authoritarianism of the Chinese Communist Party. And that doesn't mean we cannot cooperate with China. Of course, there will be areas in which we cooperate. There were areas that the West cooperated with the Soviet Union during the Cold War. The UN system was in fact created at the beginning of the Cold War, and it survived. And so I do think that multilateralism is not at the end. I think it requires some reform. And I think the chances for that reform will be the revival of the transatlantic alliance that we will see if and when Joe Biden and Kamala Harris win the elections on November 3rd. And I'd like to conclude on that optimistic note. Thank you very much. And I'm really looking forward to discussing with you.
Thank you, Dr. Freudenstein. And I'm going to pass the word immediately to Mr. Laïdi, because he is not he's not on the video, but he can hear and we can listen to him. Mr. Laïdi, please. Okay, Mr. Laïdi, can you hear us?
No, I can hear you, but do you hear me?
Well, it's a little, could you speak a little louder, because we can hear very much, okay?
Okay, so let me see. Is it okay now, or?
No. It's better.
Okay, like this?
Oh, that's perfect.
Okay.
Please.
So first, thank you very much, and sorry for this technical delay. But here we've been advised at the Commission not to use Zoom, so which is regarded as an unreliable device. That is why it's virtually forbidden here at the Commission, and that's why we had problem connecting with you. Okay, so when it comes to multilateralism, there are obviously an enormous ways of tackling the issue. So first of all, I will then concentrate on two major issues. The one is, what are the reasons why multilateralism is in crisis? Because if we do not seriously assess the causes, the multiple causes of multilateralism, I'm afraid that all solutions would be disillusional. So we need to know what are the structural factors of the crisis beyond what, for example, the American administration does or doesn't. Second, we have to look at the way Europe is answering or trying to answer or will answer, and that's precisely the work the HRVP has engaged, and he himself going to speak on Friday to give a major speech on his vision on multilateralism. So The first, in my view, there are three main reasons why multilateralism is in crisis. The first is the consequence of the emergence of a multipolar world in which we have more and more players, but less and less consensus among them. That's what I called the paradox of a multipolarity without multilateralism. So the situation in which we are is precisely a situation in which multipolarity doesn't match with multilateralism. So we then have to raise the question, why there is this discrepancy or this mismatch between multipolarity and multilateralism, whereas in principle, multilateralism is the most appropriate way of dealing with multipolarity, okay? So if you have a multiplicity of actors, you have a framework which is called multilateralism to take into account the interests of the different actors. So how can we explain this paradox between multipolarity without multilateralism? The reason is, in a sense, understandable, because if there is a mismatch between multipolarity and multilateralism, is because there is no longer a hegemonic actor capable of imposing rules of the games on everyone. And since there are several hegemonic actors who tend to disagree, they are unable to construct a consensus around them, okay? Because multilateralism worked for a long time because it was dominated by a kind of Western alliance and largely dominated by Western countries, namely the United States and Europe. So, in a context in which there is no hegemon, the temptation for those big actors is to free ride from multilateral disciplines and look for bilateral deals or unilateral actions on which they have more leverage. Okay. So the most important fact when we think about this whole issue of multilateralism is that for the first time, the major actor and the major actor is free riding. Okay. So basically the United States are free riding. And since 1945, this is the most important element. So this crisis of free riding is reflected in many ways. You have, for example, the blocking of multilateral decisions in very important fora. So you have the paralysis of the Security Council, or as you saw this morning, the appellate body of the WTO. Okay, so the blocking of institutions. Second, you have the withdrawal from a certain number of institutions or agreement. American withdrawal from the Paris Accord, from Open Skies Agreement, from UNESCO, from WHO. Third, you may have among the modalities of this crisis the refusal to accept international arbitration, which is, for example, the case of China for all conflicts related to the South China Sea, or even Turkey in the Eastern Mediterranean. Four, the practice of what we call the selective multilateralism, in which you pick and choose areas in which you implement agreements and those where you decide to not to implement them. The best example is given by China, which defends the WTO, but resists its modernization, while on human rights, it seeks to change the body language of the UN on, for example, human rights. And the final modality is the recourse to bilateralism, the best example being the the Sino-American Trade Agreement, which is obviously a source of concern for Europe because it excludes Europe from the benefits of agreements. Bilateral agreements and bilateral trade agreements are compatible or acceptable, provided that they're compatible with WTO rules and non-discrimination. And for example, we had 2 days ago a discussion with the Chinese in which we said that we wanted to get to benefit from the arrangements between the United States and China on trade. Otherwise, it would be regarded as a discriminatory agreement. So the most fundamental reason why multilateralism is in crisis has to do with what I call the paradox of a multipolarity without multilateralism. There is a second factor, a second structural factor which explains the retreat from multilateralism, and it has to do with the renewal or the return of political sovereignism by a growing number of states, including the United States, but also China, Russia, Turkey, to name but a few countries. All those states want, in a way or another, to revise the multilateral system rules. And this movement, obviously, is deeply related to the retreat of the liberal order. Okay, I mean, you cannot reasonably think of the crisis without taking into account the retreat of the liberal vision of the world, because there is a link between, for example, populism and the retreat of multilateralism, because populism, and you can even see it in Latin America, populism tends to oppose rules, norms, standards, etc. And if you look at the world picture, you see that there is a coincidence between the anti-multilateralist actors and the populist actors. So populists tend to be anti-multilateralist. And so we have to think about also the rise of populism in regard to multilateralism. So this is obviously related to the decline of the liberal order. The third reason, which explains multilateralism, and which in my view is very important, because even if we think of reestablishing a multilateral order, it's not going to be the same as it used to be. And this has to do with the incredible and increasing complexity of problems, making global and universal solutions increasingly difficult. In other words, if you take the last big example of a multilateral exercise, which was the Doha round, it's simply impossible to renew with the logic of the Doha round, in which 140 countries are debating of 120 issues. It's just simply not possible. So it seems to me that the most promising avenue for multilateralism is what we call plurilateralism, in which like-minded states decide to work on a specific issue. That's the only way to move forward. For example, on data, cybercriminality, investment rules, many other examples. Okay, that's so my interpretation of the crisis. Now, briefly, when it comes to Europe, why Europe is so keen to defend multilateralism. The first reason has to do with the EU itself. The EU is a multilateral construct. The EU is a multilateral construct, okay, based on norms and standards. So in a sense, the international system, the multilateral vision of the EU is largely derived from its own history, okay? The second reason, which is related to the first, has to do with the fact that the EU has been built against power politics, And the Europeans have always seen in multilateralism a way to temper power politics, okay? Now, the problem, as you know, is that power politics is coming back in a very tough and strong way. And we have to accommodate to that new situation. So we cannot simply preach principles at a time where reality is slightly different, when you have big powers which are free riding. Okay, so what can we do, and what do we do? First, I think that we need to distinguish three levels of actions for the EU. First, we obviously need to stick to a certain number of universal principles on which we will not make compromises, and that we consider as universal principles, such as, for example, human rights, okay? And as you probably know, there is today within a certain number of institutions an offensive coming from a certain number of countries who want to modify the body language of the United Nations on human rights. On the ground, for example, that social and economic rights need to take precedence over individual rights and personal freedom, which is for the Europeans simply unacceptable. So instead of doing what a certain number of countries are doing, and which consists in retreating from those institutions, I think that we want to invest more in those institutions to avoid the modification of a body language, which matters a lot, because all this debate has to do with the narrative of the 21st century. And as the HRVP said, there is a battle of narratives in the world, okay? The European narrative is, I would say now, overwhelmed or surrounded by other narratives which are at odds with our narrative. So it's very important to invest in those institutions to keep a certain number of principles at the core of the international institution. Universality of rights and principle, which are, in our view, intangible. So that's the first step. So there is a first level in which we think that we need to stick to some universal and reaffirm those universal principles. There is a second layer on which we are currently trying to work, and which consists in building alliances with like-minded states. We are thinking of, we have a certain number of ideas I cannot discuss here because this is part of our work, but the idea is to try to link together a certain number of like-minded states who share with us a certain number of principles related to multilateralism. And I think that such an initiative is, in my view, very important because we need to contract among us a kind of insurance policy in case of a collapse of the international order. Let's assume, for example, that the American administration in 1 week say that the United States will withdraw from the WTO. I mean, which it is not unthinkable. Okay, so we have to take initiative with like-minded states, and actually there is a substantial number of like-minded states from Asia or even Latin America who are our allies on many issues and who can constitute a kind of front aiming at protecting, preserving multilateralism, but, and I insist on this, reforming it. Because, I mean, you cannot just say, as a certain number of countries say, well, we are favorable to multilateralism. We stick to the principle of multilateralism. We support the WTO and refuse, for example, to update the rule book of the WTO, which is currently the Chinese position. So we simply not agree with this because some rules have to be changed. Okay, the level of development reached by China today is not the level of development it had when it joined the WTO. So it's simply not acceptable to have a certain number of countries which are competitors claiming that they are still developing countries. It doesn't work, and it's not going to work. So it's very important, and I will conclude on that the European position, as far as multilateralism is concerned, aim at protecting the principles and the legacy of the last 40 years in terms of principles, but at the same time, we need to reform a certain number of institutions, and that is why I think that the most promising venue for multilateralism is the kind of what I call the plurilateralism with like-minded actors, like-minded states concerned by the same issues, because we have in the world, and we have to accept it, different level of concerns. We don't have the same concerns. We may have the same principles, but we may have different concerns. So let me stop here, and sorry for being too long.
Thank you, Mr. Laïdi. And now I pass the word to Professor Dawisson to comment on both of the speakers. Please, Dawisson.
Thank you very much, Professor Soares de Lima. I extend my compliments to Ambassador Fonseca, to all CEBRI personnel, and it's an honor to interact with Professor Laïdi and Dr. Freudenstein. In order to engage and to really dialogue with my colleagues, fellow panelists, I'll try to focus on two issues and only two issues. Firstly, this alleged growing gap between Europe and the United States, which pretty much accounts for the North Atlantic Alliance. And secondly, I will try to deal with this interesting argument put forth by Professor Laïdi on the disconnection between multipolarity on the one hand and multilateralism on the other hand. So I should concentrate on these two topics. And I would start by claiming that, well, multilateralism cannot be taken for granted. This is one important thing. In the political history of mankind, actually multilateralism, as we know it today, is but a recent invention. I believe Europeans have brought it up some 200 years ago, when Europe was still at the very center of the international system. But multilateralism is just an infant international institution, a teenager actually, and it must be encouraged, it must be nurtured, it must be supported like any teenager. And what I see around, when I look around, what I see is not exactly this kind of attitude, especially on the part of the United States of America. So let's remember that multilateralism was first conceived as a formula to deal with post-Napoleonic era grievances, disputes, and in a way, I'd say it did work, because the world has experienced since the early 19th century until the early 20th century, a century-long period of peace among major powers. At a practical level, multilateralism was a good tool to deal with international health problems, like epidemics. For instance, cholera was especially dangerous in those days, 19th century days. Another issue dealt with in a successful way at a multilateral level was the free navigation of the seas and rivers, which bore an economic connotation, of course, because it has to do with freight of merchandise. So multilateralism was first devoted to more technical cooperation, but it has quickly developed into something more political in its nature. In the second half of the 19th century, and especially all along the 20th century, we have witnessed this multilateral complex, this idea of multilateralism to grow bigger, stronger. And this is what I want to emphasize. After two world wars, the US and its European allies, they have invested lots of resources. So they have supported multilateralism. They have actually erected this so-called rules-based order, or as some may like better, the liberal international order. But now, as I mentioned, the US, they are the one, especially the one actor to blame, I have this feeling, because they have been acting like a bully. It's really strange, because it's the very country which used to be the main sponsor of international organizations and institutions back in the 1940s. But since the mid-1970s, the US is retreating from multilateral settings. And this trend has been clearly aggravated since Trump's coming to power in 2017. As it has been mentioned by my fellow colleagues, Washington is withdrawing from very important forums like the UN Human Rights Council, UNESCO, the World Health Organization, now even the World Trade Organization, as we have just learned from the news yesterday. This journalist, Bob Woodward, has just released this piece of information that Brazil's Roberto Azevedo was being being pressurized. He was being asked to act in a way that would be compatible with US interests. And so this is really remarkable from a historical viewpoint. And let us not forget the lack of enthusiasm shown by Donald Trump with the North Atlantic Alliance. I still remember his early days in office, and the way, even during his campaign, his winning campaign, he kept referring to NATO as a burden, more of a burden than a solution. As I'm supposed to provide also a view from Latin America, from Brazil, from the global South, let me just refer to the case of the Inter-American Development Bank. I believe it shows in a crystal clear way how multilateral cooperation in my part of the world, in this region, is being replaced for a top-down, Washington-centered model of regional relations. And this is very, very preoccupying. Okay, let me now address the issue of China and the disconnection between multipolarity and multilateralism. This is a great topic. I go as far as to affirm that China, within this realm of multilateralism, China is the new kid on the block. And China claims to be a champion of multilateralism these days. Over the last 40 years or so, China joined dozens of regional and global bodies. And this is what strikes me as the most surprising piece of information. China is now in the lead of 4 international bureaucracies that belong to the UN system. The International Civil Aviation Organization, the International Telecommunications Union, Food and Agriculture Organization, and the UN Industrial Development Organization. And we can still remember Xi Jinping's speech at Davos World Economic Forum, where he, and this is very counterintuitive, he urged the world to commit to a liberal, rules-based order. So China's adherence to post-World War II institutional complex, it works in a very complex and even confusing way, because this adherence has not kept Beijing from creating its own multilateral world, so to speak, because there's also the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the BRICS grouping, the Asian Development Bank, to name just a few, and they make up another strand of multilateralism. They account for this China-led effort to erect an alternative to Bretton Woods, to the UN system and the like. Just to recall Harry Harris' words, it is as if China were able to accommodate, to reconcile 2 operating systems, iOS and Android, all at once. It works like this. And when it comes to Brazil, because I really believe that Brazil has a role to play in the world scenario, but we are not placed in a very comfortable position now. Brazil used to be an active promoter of multilateralism since the 19th century. And I would say that that was so until the year 2019. There were ups and downs, but Brazil was firmly committed to multilateralism, especially because of Itamaraty, Brazil's foreign ministry. There was this attitude. But then, in January 2019, Brasilia decided to recreate our diplomatic foundations. Brazil's government has embraced anti-globalism as a motto, and it has reoriented Brazil's foreign policy per Donald Trump's playbook. And here I quote Ernesto Araújo, Brazil's foreign minister: "We don't want to be the champions of multilateralism anymore." He's just said this a month ago. So this is Brazil's official position right now. I really think this poses a serious problem, because whichever multilateral arrangement that aspires to be global in coverage, it must reach Brazil, because Brazil accounts for half of South America, And if Brazil refuses to play this game, this is a dangerous thing. This is something to be tackled. We have to face this situation and try to come up with a solution, because this can be detrimental to the rest of the world. It's not just a Brazilian thing. Okay, I was given 10 minutes. Just to conclude, I'll turn to the COVID-19 pandemic. My impression, low politics, or what used to be thought of belonging to the domain of low politics, it's being transformed into high politics. So issues like global health and the environment, they now enjoy a more and more centrality as days go by. And they have even started to be treated like pressing global concerns in a way they weren't before. And the reason behind this is simple. If they were once seen as distant from our day-to-day lives, now they have literally become life or death issues. So multilateralism has to adapt. It's the only way. Okay, I think it's enough for now. I'll be glad to engage in this conversation during our Q&A session. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dawisson. We are in a hurry, and I have millions of questions here. So I would ask the panelists and start with Professor Laïdi and after Professor Freudenstein and then Professor Dawisson. And in your final comments, I will ask you to, in the case of Professor Laïdi, to comment on the idea of plurilateralism, if this kind of plurilateralism leads to a kind of Cold War logic, and they ask, this is for all, and to Professor Freudenstein to comment on what level China is undermining the transatlantic relationship in the coming years, and finally to consider also, as Professor Laïdi, the idea of how different are the populist government in terms of their, to their criticism of multilateral commitments. Are there differences and nuance between such governments and China under the CCP's rule? Well, I forgot to, these are from the audience. I have to mix all of them, so I didn't give the numbers, but it's on the chat, so you can cover that. So I go straight to Professor Laïdi, and please comment, especially on the issue of plurilateralism and the commitment or non-commitment, refusal of commitment of neo-populist government to multilateral rules, and then to Professor Freudenstein, and then Professor Dawisson. Please, Professor.
Okay, but what is the question exactly? Sorry, I didn't hear. No,
there are a lot of questions on the idea of plurilateralism. The audience asks you all to comment on that. And there is one specific to you on plurilateralism, that the idea in a scenario with alliance of like-minded countries, it seems they would return to a Cold War logic of ideological sectarism. And I would ask how you can allow diversity in a world organized by like-minded countries. I mean, this is the first, and the second is the difference between neo-populist governments that reject multilateralism and the current government of China. Please.
Do you hear me? Oops.
Can you hear me?
Yeah. Okay. That's fine.
Very quickly, because we are in a hurry.
Sorry. On like-minded states, the idea is to have a sort of political commitment between the EU and countries of Asia or Latin America, who may share the view that we need to stick to a certain number of principles around multilateralism, but at the same time to renew a certain number of rules to accommodate the new world. Okay, so it's a kind of third way between those who want to leave the system to unilateralism and those who may have a conservative approach to multilateralism. In other words, I think that confronted to a potential Sino-American confrontation, we need to create a sort of third space in which those who are attached and supportive of multilateralism want at the same time to protect that multilateralism in having new rules of conduct in some specific areas. Because, you know, when you look at the multilateral scene today, you see that an incredible number of issues are not addressed by multilateral institutions. For example, the artificial intelligence, the question of data, cyber, and many other things like that, standards for batteries and so on. All those issues need to be tackled at the international level. And because of a lack of consensus among the major actors, each one is trying to launch its own initiative. For example, China has decided and proposed a sort of digital global initiative. So if we want to avoid a kind of splinter net, for example, we really need to take charge of those new issues which are going to shape the future of the 21st century. So we need to have a multilateral system capable of taking into account those new issues. Which brings me to the second point, which concerns plurilateralism. That precisely because issues are so numerous, so different, so complex, that you cannot reasonably deal with all those issues with all actors at the same time. So we need to start with a group of interested countries on a specific issues. And after reaching an agreement, you may extend and expand those rules and standards to the rest of the world, provided, of course, that the arrangement made by the like-minded actors on a specific area in a plurilateral agreement is not discriminatory for the rest of the world. And that actually the way things are in fact working. Within the WTO, you have today what we call the plurilateral agreement on public procurement, okay, in which a certain number of countries make commitments related to the opening of their markets for public procurement. And for example, Europe is waiting for new proposals made by China in regard to public procurement because its market is still not very favorable to external actors. So we need, in other words, to focus on specific issues among like-minded states on specific issues, and also create a sort of coalition which create a third way between, let's say, the United States and China in general. Over.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Laïdi. Mr. Freudenstein, please, your final comments.
Great final comments. Thank you. So I'll address this question: how is China undermining the transatlantic relationship? I would say this happens on 3 levels. First of all, China is a systemic rival to the West, to all free societies, in fact. And this has been especially visible in the COVID-19 pandemic, where now Xi Jinping is openly talking about China being the superior model of a society because it's more disciplined, because it's better organized, because there's a clear authority between, clear hierarchy between the authorities and individual citizens, and collectivism and what have you. So that is something which is directed against the West in general. China is also trying, which is the usual thing you do if you're alone and you're confronted with a whole group of competitors or rivals, you try to divide the rivals among themselves. And, I've been to Shanghai for 3 successive Euro-Chinese conferences last year for a couple of days. And the one overriding message we got from the Chinese Communist Party representatives and the professors of different universities was, look, we Chinese have given up on the US. We don't want to deal with them anymore. We want to achieve the achievable goals with you Europeans. So you forget about the US. That is, as I said before, not a viable option for us. But the attempt is there to divide the 2 sides of the Atlantic. And the third level on which Chinese efforts are ongoing are actually to weaken the European Union itself, to play member states against each other. We've had the unprecedented case during the COVID-19 crisis of Chinese cyber attacks against European hospitals. It happened in Czechia, right? And Commission President von der Leyen was courageous enough to actually confront the Chinese leadership with that, who of course didn't comment and claimed that this did not take place. But if she says that, then it cannot be some kind of invention. So, but playing the member states against each other with the Belt and Road Initiative, with the so-called 17+1 China, with the poorer member states of the European Union and some countries in the Western Balkans, all this is happening, all these attempts are happening. And I think the last couple of months have clearly shown that Europeans are just not buying this anymore. So what I would like to say as an answer to these Chinese attempts to undermine the West, to divide the Atlantic Alliance, and to weaken the European Union, I think we are beginning to wake up to the threat, and I think we're getting our act together.
Thank you, Professor Freudenstein. And to end your final comments, Professor Lopes.
Very quickly, I just want to draw my colleagues' attention to the changing nature of multilateralism. It has been so over the course of the last 200 years. It's happening now as we talk, not just because issues are changing, processes are changing, but mostly because regional powers have been behaving in new ways, and multilateralism is less and less Western-centric. So when you look around and see what China or Brazil, what they are performing, you have a hint at the sources of this crisis, this arguable crisis of multilateralism. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dawisson. I wonder if Professor Gelson can comment on that or can make a final comments. I thank you all the panelists, Professor Freudenstein, Professor Laïdi, Professor Lopes, and I pass the word to Ambassador Gelson Fonseca to your last remarks.
No, just to thank you, thank you the speakers. I think it was an excellent webinar, and your contribution for the research that CEBRI is developing is extremely important. So thank you very much, and I hope we'll see you in another webinar. Thank you, Professor Freudenstein. Thank you, Dawisson. Thank you, Professor Laïdi, and thank you, Regina, for conducting the the webinar.
Thank you all.
Good morning and good evening.
Good afternoon and good morning. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.